Alrighty. Charles Cornish-Dale, aka Raw Egg Nationalist, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast, and congratulations on your latest book, The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. Hold it up. There we go.
There we
I've
go.
read it. It's a cracking read. There is still, though, a big divide in the world between those who get their news through social media and those who get it through more traditional means. Those who are online, probably too much, will know exactly who you are, and those who aren't will have no idea. So, in a nutshell, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you. So, who am I? Well, I started. I mean, I have a background in academia, firstly. So, I got a PhD from Oxford in medieval history. I was at Cambridge before that. But around about 2020, I started posting anonymously on the internet as Raw Egg Nationalist, and I got a pretty big following quite quickly. Actually, within a couple of years, I had a big following for posting about health and fitness and politics and the intersection between um, health and fitness and politics as well, which is actually something that I think has been neglected for some time. So that's kind of what the raw egg nationalist thing means, is it's a combination of, let's say, right-wing politics and also kind of health and fitness, bodybuilding, that kind of stuff. In 2022, I was the star, along with RFK Jr., of a Tucker Carlson documentary called The End of Men, about testosterone decline and the political implications of testosterone decline. The documentary caused a big stink, and for about 5 minutes, as these things do in the media cycle, and that really kind of propelled me even sort of even more on social media. So I mean, I've got 300,000 followers. My identity was revealed actually by a left-wing activist group in the UK in 2024, called Hope Not Hate, which kind of actually works in collusion with the government and with the intelligence services. So that was interesting. Um, but yeah, I've continued writing as myself and as the Raw Egg Nationalist, and my new book is my first book under my own name, Dr. Charles Cornish-Dale. And it's a continuation, really, of the themes of the Tucker Carlson documentary that I was in. So it's about the political implications of testosterone decline. And it asks some unsettling questions as well about the nature of liberalism and whether liberalism is, in some meaningful sense, actually a low testosterone political system.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a lot more depth. But you started off, you mentioned studying medieval history.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in health? What was the crossover between that and focusing on slonking raw eggs each day?
Yeah, so that's the technical term for drinking raw eggs, is slonking. Yeah, it seems like it's a funny sort of transition, but I mean, um, I was always a sportsman at school. Like I was a martial artist. I taught kickboxing in my late teens and competed a little bit and that kind of stuff. So I've always been interested in health and fitness, and have always been kind of active. Was very into bodybuilding when I was a teenager as well. I had the Arnold Schwarzenegger Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. This very, very famous book. Um, that I used to kind of look at religiously. I just kind of fell into it. I mean, it's been this abiding interest of mine, and I've always kept myself fit and whatever. But I read Bronze Age Mindset in 2017 when that came out.
Mm.
It's quite strange, actually, because it was recommended to me by Amazon not long after it came out. So I wasn't familiar with Bronze Age Pervert from the forum days, because he was on various internet
Mm.
forums like the Sarlo forum and the Roosh forum and other places like that. I wasn't familiar with him from there, but it was just recommended to me because I mean, I've always been like a long time reader of Nietzsche, and so I think it just got fed to me by the algorithm. But anyway, I read that, and that really got me thinking about biology and politics and health and politics. And then I just sort of naturally kind of made my way towards Twitter and started following Bronze Age Pervert, and was largely was lurking for a long time actually on Twitter. So just following people and just sort of enjoying their posts, but not really having anything to say myself, or not thinking that there was anything it was worth saying anything. And then I just fell into it. I mean, one of the funny things actually is that I've tried over the last, however long, to sort of reconstruct what has actually happened to me, because it's very strange. It's very strange to go from having 0 followers on Twitter with a totally anonymous persona to having hundreds of thousands of followers and being on Tucker Carlson's news show and in a documentary and all that kind of stuff. It's quite weird, but I mean, it's not the radical change you might think it is. At least for me, like I was into health and fitness. I was
Mm,
have always been a sportsman, so it's not like it was a complete revelation for me. But I think coming to understand some of the political implications of health and fitness and biology, that was more of a revelation for me. Actually, was really
mm,
starting to think about, what does it actually mean if you have a population that is almost entirely obese, suffering from other forms of chronic disease, uh, where all the men have low testosterone and no motivation, or a large proportion of them do. So I had abiding interest in health, but they've become more political in recent years,
mm.
largely, I think, as a result of reading Bronze Age Pervert and then getting involved in the online Twitter right, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So the question your book poses is whether it is possible for men to be um, fully men in a liberal society.
Mm.
What do you mean exactly? Why should masculinity and liberalism be in conflict?
Well, so what's interesting and what might be unexpected actually for readers is the way that the book is framed. So the book is actually framed in terms of Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. So Fukuyama is one of these people thinkers who's much parodied and much, he's been made into this straw man. Fukuyama is the guy who thought that history ended when the Berlin Wall fell, and
Mm,
nothing else would ever happen, and it was all just going to be, the sunny uplands of liberalism forever. um and he has kind of become something of a parody of himself. I mean, he has kind of become that parody, as a lot of people do. When they're parodied, they kind of end up becoming the parody. But the end of history, and the last man, and that's the part of the title that people forget, is and the last man. It's not just the end of history. Um, the final quarter of the book is this really, really penetrating Nietzschean critique of life under liberal democracy. What is life like when liberal democracy is like the hegemonic system? There's no alternative. What happens to man? Um, well, what happens is he becomes the last man, this kind of crepuscular figure that Nietzsche describes in his philosophy. Uh, something, a man who is kind of less than a man who has no grand ambitions, no great projects, no real kind of religious sense, no kind of higher purpose. All he does is he is a consumer, and he is one among millions of people, one among millions of equal people in a democracy. Interchangeable, unexceptional. Um, so that's the kind of the framing of the book is essentially that, like, okay, so we're in this kind of liberal democratic end state, right? We've seen the triumph of liberal democracy, uh, liberal capitalism, over its main competitor in the 20th century, communism.
mm,
And that has implications for the kinds of behaviors that men can engage in. There are certain things you can do as a citizen in a liberal democracy, and there's certain things that you can't. You have this limited horizon for behavior and fulfillment. So that's really the starting point is Francis Fukuyama. But in particular, I look at this. He uses this Greek term thymos to describe the trajectory of history and to describe the kinds of behaviors that are and aren't acceptable in a liberal democracy. So thymos is basically, it's an ancient Greek term, and what it means is something like spiritedness. So Plato has this like tripartite division of the soul, where you have like the organism overall is controlled by reason, but then he has thymos, which are these appetites and desires and drives, um, uh, and thymos is what motivates men. And Fukuyama tells the story where he says that basically the triumph of liberal democracy is the triumph of a particular kind of thymos at the expense of others. So there's isothymia, which is a desire to be recognized as equal. Now that can be satisfied, obviously, in a liberal democracy. We're all accorded the same formal rights and the same value as individual citizens, and supposedly the same equal opportunities as well. But then there's another type of thymos called megalothymia, which is a desire to assert oneself as better than others. It's like the desire that drives us to be better, to compete, to outcompete, to establish hierarchies. That's very difficult to satisfy under democracy, and that's exactly what Fukuyama says. Is that like there is a very limited scope in a democracy to satisfy this fundamental urge that the Greeks recognize among men to compete and outcompete each other and to be better. Um, but what's interesting about this whole kind of account of thymos is actually you can kind of use thymos as an analogy for testosterone or as a proxy for testosterone. So what's interesting is that the behaviors that are associated with testosterone, striving, motivation, competitiveness, um, desire to establish hierarchy and to move up a hierarchy, those are all behaviors that are scientifically associated with testosterone. Reams and reams of data about the way that testosterone motivates men, what it drives them to do. And also then you have, evidence about what it's like to have low testosterone. I mean, a low testosterone man is unmotivated, etc. Um, so I kind of redefine Fukuyama's account as as a kind of hormonal account of the progression of civilization. So we've arrived at this liberal democratic end state where um, certain behaviors associated with testosterone simply cannot, by the nature of the system, within the boundaries of the system, be satisfied. So that's a problem. So that's like the
Mm.
starting problem, is that actually, like this political system allows um, only very particular kinds of behavior that are or aren't associated with testosterone to be expressed. And of course, what you have to understand is about testosterone as the kind of master male hormone, as a hormone that governs male development and behavior, is that it's not only a biological thing, it's a biological and a social thing. So it's in a kind of a series of feedback loops. Like if you don't have outlets to behave in a way that is associated with having more testosterone, then you don't have more testosterone. Like for example, you need to win. You need to do things. You need to assert yourself in order to kind of keep this feedback loop going. So, I mean, it's quite a complicated thing, but broadly, then that's the starting point is this kind of reframing of Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis of his account of what happens to thymos over time in Western civilization as a hormonal problem or
Mm.
hormonal
Yeah,
or a hormonal subject.
I just wonder how new this phenomenon is. I mean, you could point to late stage civilizations in China and Europe in the
Mm.
past, where famously good times create soft men or
Sure.
whatever this
Mm,
is, and people
mm,
they they focus on leisure, and there's a certain ennui that sets in. Is
yes.
what you're describing today different to those periods that might have existed in the past? Is there any distinction that you draw between the two of them?
Well, I mean, one of the problems, obviously, with studying hormones in history is that you
Mm,
can't go back and do blood tests
mm,
of like the average man in uh,
mm,
like Qing China or whatever,
mm, mm,
or at the end of the Roman Empire and that kind of stuff. I mean, there are certain proxies that can be used for testosterone, like in a very long term view, you can look at facial features skeletal features, craniofacial features as a
mm,
proxy for testosterone. So there's this thesis actually that over the last 50,000 years, testosterone levels have been dropping because they look at the bones of really ancient hunter gatherers and they have
mm,
much more prominent brow ridges, much more prominent facial features that are associated with higher testosterone. And so
mm,
there's this theory that actually the transition from hunter gathering to larger, more complex societies may have necessitated a
mm,
reduction in testosterone levels in order to facilitate cooperation. Now, I do and don't agree with that in the sense because actually testosterone isn't an antisocial hormone. There are plenty of studies that show that actually testosterone makes men work better together. So,
mm,
um, but
mm,
like,
mm,
yeah, but parallels within history. I mean, yeah, I do. One of the things I try to talk about in the book, actually, like when I'm talking about fertility, for example,
mm,
is that, I mean, we are facing a profound fertility crisis.
mm,
Testosterone decline is bound up in this much larger collapse in fertility parameters, especially sperm counts. But other societies, and I talk about a few examples, ancient Sparta, the ancient Scythians, these were nomads who were living in the kind of Black Sea area in the ancient Greek world, the Comanche, the Plains Indians. Um,
mm,
they suffered fertility problems too, profound fertility problems. And so, yeah, I mean, there are definitely parallels throughout history. And I do think that actually you could write quite an ambitious history actually of civilizations in terms of different hormones, but very little people have ever really touched on that subject. I mean, one of the people who has is Camille Paglia, and I
mm,
start the book actually with a quotation from Sexual Personae, where she talks about the difference between men and women, and in hormonal terms, in terms of estrogen and testosterone, and why men are so different from women because of the nature of androgens uh, as opposed to estrogen. And it's interesting. It's interesting because actually, like Camille Paglia, I mean, I would describe her as a high testosterone woman. I mean, she's an unusual woman. She's very assertive. She's very feisty. She's got a lot of fight in her. She's quite
mm,
masculine. But she actually, what's funny is she understands testosterone a lot better than uh, so many of these writers today who are writing about the crisis of masculinity. Senator Josh Hawley, Richard Reeves, who wrote this book of Boys and Men, like they actually have nothing to say about testosterone. So
mm.
there's a big gap, I think, in the literature uh, about the kind of biological nature of social and political crises, not just
Mm.
our own, but also perhaps maybe more broadly throughout history.
Yeah. I like to think to myself when reading the morning papers, what would the Normans make of this? Because
Hmm.
so
Sure.
baked into all the assumptions and political assumptions today are liberal assumptions about, say, free
Mhm.
trade and free migration, or
Yeah.
open borders migration, and everything else,
Mm.
which the Normans obviously wouldn't have liked, right? They would have thought, hang on, this doesn't make sense. We're not outsourcing production. We're not allowing these foreigners to come in and, I don't know,
Mhm.
woo our women and the like. But eh, when I was reading your book, I was almost thinking it's kind of the natural happy state of man to be part of a bunch of warriors who are going
Mm.
out there to
Yeah.
conquer, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that necessarily, it's dangerous, and at some level, unless you're kind of Genghis Khan and you're continuing to
Mm.
ride until on the never-ending border, it isn't sustainable. But so can't you have? Isn't there a type of masculinity which, I don't know, can be channeled into raising families and children and the like, which can be satisfied in its goals through other means rather than
Mhm.
conquering other nations?
Well, sure. I mean, so yes, I mean, I think that this is a problem, of course. I think that, and it's a problem. It's a problem that I pose in the book, but I don't answer because I don't
Mm,
think there are actually any easy answers. I mean,
mm,
the book. I have this framing from Fukuyama about the nature of liberalism and whether it's actually a high or a low testosterone system, and
mm,
then I go into the environmental factors, in particular, biological factors, things like exposure to harmful chemicals, obesity that are kind of causing.
It's probably worth just stating, because we haven't already, we've just assumed that people know this. But you write in the book, sperm count has declined by over 50% in the last 50 years,
Yeah.
and if current trends continue by 2050, the median sperm count will be 0, which means that one half of men will produce no sperm at all,
Yep.
and the other half will produce so few that they might as well produce none. I mean, but they're shocking figures. They're not as well known as they
Mhm.
should be.
No.
Um, how credible are they? How confident are you of those figures?
I mean, so that prediction, for example, about sperm counts, that's often referred to as spermageddon, which is kind of funny. But that prediction is made on the basis of existing trends in sperm counts by the foremost expert in reproductive health in the world, or one of them, this Professor Shanna Swan, who is at Mount Sinai University in New York.
Mm,
She released a book in 2022 called Countdown, about the collapse in sperm counts. And, she was on Joe Rogan. I mean, she's very,
right.
very credible. She's very, very credible. I mean, with all of these things, so there's a similar kind of civilizational collapse in testosterone levels as well, 1% year on year. So, 25 years, it's 25%, 50 years, 50%. Um, uh, there are a few quibbles here and there about how you measure these things and whether the measurements are all necessarily kind of equivalent in each study that's been done. That's kind of always the case, I think, with scientific studies. But more broadly, um, you would expect to see a civilizational collapse in fertility parameters on the basis of everything we know, everything else we know about health that's happening, right? So
Mm,
70% of adults in the US are either overweight or obese, right? And being overweight or obese is associated with reduced fertility, reduced testosterone, reduced sperm counts. Um, Levels of other chronic diseases are through the roof. um, People move less than they've ever moved. People are more sedentary, and they're also exposed to harmful chemicals in a way that they just weren't 100 years ago. I mean, these chemicals didn't exist 100 years ago. So,
yeah, yeah. So you're sort of saying, like, the political system that you live in, when it gets too easy, or where freedom of the individual is sort of stressed above all else in the liberal system, that that conflicts with natural sort of masculine tendencies, and testosterone declines, but also in an
yeah,
unprecedented way with
mm,
these chemicals
yeah,
everywhere. Can you give a sense of what is different in terms of these chemicals out there? Because I don't think they
yeah,
might think it's kooky,
yeah.
or they might not be aware of what is out there. What's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, so the argument is that it's kind of a perfect storm. We've got this
Mm,
political system that doesn't really encourage uh, testosterone boosting behavior, let's say, and then we've got this whole
mm,
lifestyle and environmental problem that's just really making it even worse. So it's a vicious circle, really, is
mm,
what it is, self perpetuating, and just gets worse and worse. Um, so yeah, the environmental chemicals thing is a big thing, and it's something that's only just really kind of starting to enter into public consciousness. I mean,
mm,
in the US now, it's a big part of Make America Healthy Again.
mm,
I mentioned at the beginning, that I was in a Tucker Carlson documentary. RFK Jr. was in that documentary with me, who's now Secretary of Health and Human Services.
mm,
And one of the main focuses was on these harmful chemicals. Um,
mm,
they're basically everywhere. So one of the strange kinks of modern chemistry and modern industrial production, commercial production, is that virtually every chemical that is produced seems to mimic estrogen in the human body. So these chemicals are often referred to as xenoestrogens, which it means like foreign estrogens, basically.
mm,
So they're artificial and sometimes also natural chemicals. So chemicals in soy, phytoestrogens in soy and hops and in other plants also mimic estrogen in the human body. But we've got this massive, in tens of thousands. We actually don't know exactly how many chemicals there are We don't know how many chemicals, for example, are associated with the manufacture of plastic. They tried to do a survey recently and tried to work out how many chemicals are associated with or used in the manufacture of plastics. And it's like they just don't know, but they say, oh, there've got to be over 10,000 different plastic chemicals on the market that are being used. The vast majority are toxic, and some seriously toxic. But almost all of them seem to mimic the female hormone estrogen in the human body. And what that does is that upsets the crucial balance between testosterone and estrogen in the human body. And that's what determines whether you are male or female
Mm.
from the moment of conception. So in the womb. So you have more testosterone and less estrogen, you're a woman. You're a man. You have more estrogen and less testosterone, you're a woman. And if you upset those ratios, really bad things happen.
Mm.
Really bad things happen. So people are being exposed to these estrogenic chemicals on a daily basis in the food, in the water, in the air. You're inhaling microscopic pieces of plastic, microplastics, which carry they're called endocrine disrupting chemicals, is the broad category. So the endocrine system is the hormone system, and they interfere with it with various range of effects from obesity, diabetes, cancer, reproductive issues, pretty much every chronic disease actually you can think of is associated in one way or another with these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So it's a huge problem. It's a pervasive problem. And it just didn't exist 100 years ago or 150
Mm.
years ago because none of these chemicals existed. Like that's something I try to convey in the book. It's like, this is unprecedented. Like, yeah, the ancient Spartans had fertility problems because they were basically like a totally militarized fascist um, society, that was geared towards war, and you have fertility problems because women can't produce enough male warriors to keep up with the churn rate as a
Mm.
result of constant wars. But no society has ever had to contend with basically like living in a toxic soup of estrogen, which is what we do now.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean these chemicals. This is a serious problem, and it's not an insurmountable problem, but it's a huge problem that goes beyond the efforts of any one individual. Like there are ways you can protect yourself, you can reduce your exposure to these things, but ultimately what you need is you actually do need a political movement to change
Yeah.
regulations, to clean up the environment, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a
Has
huge problem.
has there been anything like the Make America Healthy Again agenda or movement in the UK or in Europe? Because amongst new right parties or
Mhm.
indeed any party, I haven't seen it. Maybe I'm not
No.
aware, but I haven't seen it. Right. So it's a uniquely American phenomenon driven by
Mhm.
RFK, right? Junior. It's sort of
Yes, I
amazing.
mean I think it's worth it. I think it's worth emphasizing that there is a big grassroots movement
Mm.
behind Make America Healthy Again. Like
Mm.
it's genuinely a unifying issue.
I agree.
It's a non-partisan issue in the U. Although it is partisan, you get people from both sides uniting behind the basic proposition that like we should protect our children's health. We don't want to live in a toxic environment. A nation is only as healthy as the people of which it is composed. So, we've got to do something to protect our children, to protect the future of the nation, and, do something about chronic disease. It is interesting actually that basically no European right party has picked up on
Mm.
the potential electoral success of Make America Healthy Again. I think part of the reason why it's really stuck in the US is because America is the unhealthiest nation on earth, more or less. I mean, you will find some fatter nations in the South Pacific, for example,
Mm.
where like 90% of people are overweight or obese. But
Mm.
seen holistically, America is the unhealthiest, most poisoned nation on earth. It's
Mm.
where industrial society is kind of at its pinnacle, and all the excesses are more or less at their worst. So I can see why it's taken root in America first, but nevertheless, the rest of the West isn't very far behind America.
mm,
And in many respects, in a country like the UK, for example, then the situation is worse. I mean, diets for children in the UK are worse than in the US in
mm.
terms of ultra processed food consumed, for example. Then, like toddlers, children aged 2 to 5, then they get something like 2/3 of their daily calories from ultra processed foods in the UK, whereas it's something like 58% in the US. I mean, yeah, it swings and roundabouts really, but nevertheless, like the situation is actually worse in certain respects in some European countries. So it's a
Do you know
shame.
whether to inject a bit of Ash's rivalry, do you know whether Australia is better or worse than the UK? I mean, I would have thought we'd be better just because of the outdoors and the sunshine and perhaps
Yeah,
healthier food, but I wouldn't be
I
convinced about yeah.
I think, I mean, I know that with the ultra processed food, so it was a study about toddlers' consumption of ultra processed food, and I remember the UK was worse, and then it was the US and Australia. So,
Mm,
I mean, but I would imagine that there are certain health benefits conferred simply by the amount of sunlight that Australians get
yeah. And yes,
relative.
as you say, it is kind of amazing that the political parties outside the US haven't latched onto this because
Mm,
it is, you do get a weird crossover between the inner city yoga girls
y-
and the gym bros, right wing gym bros on this issue, right? Gwyneth
yeah,
Paltrow and
yeah,
and oh, I don't know, Ross Douthat, sort of could be united on these things. You know,
yes.
so yeah, so it hasn't taken off. I mean, the other big issue which your book raises, which I thought was quite interesting, is the impact of endocrine disruptors on gender fluidity. Let's call it
Yeah.
broadly. What did you discover? What do you think is the current people should people know about that?
Yeah, so okay, so there is a big chapter on Alex Jones and the gay frogs theory, right? So this is, or the gay frogs conspiracy theory, as it was um, labeled by the mainstream media and commentators. So, Alex Jones back in 2015 embarked on what will become a very famous rant about chemicals in the water turning the freaking frogs gay. And he was referencing some studies that had been done about 5 years before 2010 by a researcher in the US called Tyrone Hayes. And he had exposed African clawed frog larvae, male African clawed frog larvae, to atrazine, which is the second most used herbicide in the US. It's used in the millions and millions of gallons across the US, mainly in the Midwest on corn and soy, but it's also sprayed on lawns and in gardens. Like this is a ubiquitous chemical. And
Mm,
he exposed male African clawed frog larvae to atrazine, and a significant proportion of them changed gender. They actually changed gender, so they developed into female frogs, and then they were actually able to mate with male frogs successfully. So
mm,
it caused a complete
mm,
gender flip. Um, uh, and what's interesting, or what is also interesting, is that at the time in 2010, these findings were taken very, very seriously by the scientific community and the media. They were in Science magazine and National Geographic, and all the newspapers were talking about it. Like, what's going on? If atrazine, second most commonly used herbicide in the US, which most people are exposed to, or a significant proportion of the population exposed to, can cause frogs to change their gender from male to female, what's it doing to us? Could it be having similar effects?
mm,
Could it be interfering with sexual development? Because
mm,
what you have to understand with these chemicals is that they can interfere in the process of sexual development and maturation at any point from conception. So, sexual development is governed by exposure to testosterone and estrogen at key moments
mm,
in the womb, in early infancy. There's a process called mini puberty, which is like a little puberty, and then at puberty, and then even after puberty. So, like masculine and feminine traits, physical traits, behavior, uh, are determined by exposure to androgens and estrogen. And so it was absolutely plausible to be inferring from these frog studies and from other studies as well. So there's so much literature on endocrine disruptors, thousands of papers, right?
Mm.
It was perfectly legitimate for people to be asking, okay, if it's doing this to frogs, could it be doing this to humans too? We're not that different from frogs. And that's why frogs are used in experimental studies, why rodents are used in experimental studies. Like, there are differences, of course, and you do have to take into account the differences. You can't directly infer from a frog to a person, but what you can say is this suggests that we should be taking this seriously in humans too. And
Mm.
that's what the media was doing. So National Geographic Science, all these other magazines, newspapers were taking it seriously. Alex Jones starts talking about it 5 years later, and it becomes a conspiracy theory.
Mm.
It's insane. Alex Jones has lost. Well, he hasn't lost it. He'd already lost his mind. But, he's spouting another crazy conspiracy theory about population control and um,
Mm.
all this kind. I mean, he didn't he didn't help himself by dressing up as a gay frog subsequently. So
Yes.
the rant went viral. It became an indie song, and Alex Jones dressed up as a frog in a tutu and was sipping from a bottle that said atrazine on it and cooing that he was a gay frog. But it it became almost overnight the notion that actually exposure to common chemicals could be having gender bending effects. That became a conspiracy theory, right? And so you couldn't talk about it without being labeled a conspiracy theorist, without being labeled kook. Um, you couldn't really do scientific research into it either. And I mean, transgenderism is one of the most toxic issues, I think, in modern Western societies.
Mm.
Along with immigration, transgenderism. I mean, transgenderism really is at the forefront of the radical leftist agenda. It's the sharp end of the spear, if you will.
Mm.
So for all sorts of reasons, any kind of direct investigation of the relationship between transgenderism or gender dysphoria and exposure to harmful chemicals was largely precluded, even
Mm.
though there was a growing body of evidence and a strong prima facie case to suggest that actually the explosion of gender dysphoria within Western societies could have something to do with growing exposure to chemicals that interfere in the process of sexual differentiation and maturation, right? Like,
Mm.
on paper, it's perfectly plausible, but just no one would touch it. Well, so I talk about this in a chapter. I talk about, what happened with the gay frogs theory and why it was plausible but
Mm.
didn't get explored. There's now a study, it came out like 2 years ago, end of
Mm.
2024, where some researchers looked at prenatal exposure to a vicious endocrine disrupting chemical called DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was given very, very tragically to mothers from the 1950s into sort of the 1970s. It was given to mothers who had a history of miscarriages while they were pregnant to prevent them from having a further miscarriage.
Mm.
Uh, and it was eventually taken off the market because it was very clearly associated with birth defects and with rare forms of cancer, uterine cancers, breast cancers. Um, but they did a study of French boys who had been exposed to DES in the womb and rates of transgenderism among those boys, and they found an enormous increase in the incidence of transgenderism against the background rate as a result of prenatal exposure to DES in the womb. So we had this prima facie case that gender dysphoria, the explosion of gender dysphoria, might be related to endocrine disrupting chemicals. And now we have a paper that says, look, here is a clear correlation in a human population. Um, so like there's not just a prima facie case to be answered
mm,
now. I mean, when you try to talk about transgenderism as anything other than a sincere expression of a person's true nature,
mm,
you're in trouble, right? Like this is a very, very controversial topic, and you're subject to hysterical wailing and gnashing of teeth, and also
mm,
threats of violence. I mean, you only need
mm.
to look at what's happened to J.K. Rowling,
Yep.
right? I mean, it has lit a torch under her reputation. What among certain people anyway. I mean, other
Mm,
people think she's a very, very brave woman, and good on her for speaking out about something that she actually believes in, when she could just, sit at home counting her money all day. Um,
mm.
but so there have been other attempts to explain transgenderism in terms of social
Social.
contagion,
Yeah.
for
Mm,
example. So it's like, you have groups of children, and if one of them decides that they've got gender dysphoria, others will. It's catching, basically. It's like you want
mm,
to be like your mates. There's an increased risk of if one person in a friendship group gets it, other people will start saying they've got it too.
mm,
And then there's also explanations in terms of mental illness, in terms of the fact that people who think they're transgender tend to have at least one or more other psychiatric comorbidities, um, like serious depression,
mm,
anxiety, um, borderline personality disorder, all those kinds of things. But there hasn't been, until now, a serious, sustained attempt to argue that some of the problem, I'm not saying all of the problem, I'm not saying that everybody who thinks they are transgender has had a massive dose of endocrine disrupting chemicals at some point during their life or whatever.
mm,
But nevertheless, I do think that it is clearly a factor, and must be a factor in some cases. This
mm.
this pervasive exposure from conception to estrogenic chemicals, and I think I lay out a pretty good
Yeah.
case in the book
And
for that.
in some ways, it's a way of sort of resetting the argument because
Mhm.
you're saying to these people, look, they may have been impacted by
Mm.
something beyond their control, and
Yes.
beyond their choice, we
Mm.
should look into it so that it doesn't happen to others who don't necessarily
Yeah.
want that to happen to them. One
Yeah.
question I had throughout it all, and you touched on it in the book, admittedly, is how much is of this um, suppression of testosterone throughout the globe, really, but particularly in Western societies, is but at both a political level and through the chemicals, is deliberate. How much of this has been intentionally done?
Mm.
Um,
I mean, one of the things that I say, and I don't think it's glib. It might sound glib,
mm,
is that if if all of these chemicals, rather than promoting estrogen, promoted testosterone, if all of the chemicals you're exposed to through plastics and all this other stuff made men more assertive, more motivated, gave them muscle mass, made them more aggressive, made them more thrusting, then actually the environment would have been cleaned up a long time ago. I think governments and organizations would have taken the problem of harmful chemicals much more seriously if it was sort of creating a society of kind of giga chad men who who were much harder to govern. The truth is, though, that actually this kind of process of feminization, whatever you want to call it, um, in many ways does make people easier to govern. It absolutely does, which in a sense obviates the question of whether or not it's deliberate or not. Like the functional outcome is the same in that it tends to the maintenance of the system and the maintenance of the status quo, um, and it kind of benefits society's rulers. I mean, there are sections in the book, well, there is one section in the book, I think it's in the Alex Jones section, where I talk about whether it's deliberate. And I think it's a kink of the industrial system that these chemicals just turn out to promote estrogen. I think that's just a kink of biology and chemistry.
mm,
Um, it's unfortunate, but I think it is a kink. I don't think when people were inventing plastics that they thought, you know what, we're only going to use um, plasticizers and shapers and hardeners, that promote estrogen. Nobody thought that. That just no. I mean, that isn't how it works. And plastic didn't become the pervasive, the ubiquitous substance that it is because of its estrogenic properties. It became the ubiquitous substance that it is because it's so useful, because you can shape it easily and cheaply and make it, and like it's perfect for so many different uses. You can make an iPhone, or you can make a food container, or you can make a computer mouse, or whatever, or a car dashboard from plastic, right? Like, it's a very useful substance. And one of the problems is that we have this attitude that's basically safe until proven otherwise when we regulate chemicals. And so we don't test chemicals thoroughly enough before we introduce them to the market. And that's the case with plastics, right? We did not understand that they had these harmful properties until we'd created a world that is completely reliant on plastic. Like, if
mm,
you eliminated plastic now, I mean, you'd have to have an alternative. You would have to have an alternative, and we don't. Um, but nevertheless, there are examples, and there's one example in particular that I talk about in the book, which is 3M and DuPont and PFAS chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are chemicals that are used in non-stick coatings, firefighting foams, plastics, fire retardants, anti-stick stuff. Um, they're they're chemicals that were invented in the 1940s, and the manufacturers knew for decades that they were seriously harmful, that they were associated with particular kinds of cancer, with reproductive issues, birth defects. So, people working on these chemicals in the factories, the women were giving birth to children with birth defects at, like, seriously elevated rates. The manufacturers, 3M, DuPont, and other manufacturers of PFAS chemicals, knew that their chemicals were seriously toxic.
mm,
Um, and they hid the data from regulators in the US and around the world. And it came out decades later, after the big class action lawsuits, what they'd been doing. And they are currently settling cases, I think, in the hundreds of billions of dollars for damages caused by these chemicals. And what's even worse about these chemicals is that they're often referred to as forever chemicals because they're extremely hard to get rid of. They don't break down easily in the environment. They accumulate in the body, in fat stores. They're a nightmare. They're awful. And these companies deliberately suppressed knowledge of their harmful effects so they could make more money. They
mm,
kept pumping them out, new uses for them, allowing them to be used, and then it turns out that they are actually enormously toxic. So that's very close to a situation in which
mm.
harmful chemicals have been deliberately introduced into the supply, into the like wider
It-
food
it
supply
never,
and environment.
but nevertheless, today, given the risks do seem to be still downplayed, don't they? I mean,
Yes.
notwithstanding your efforts and RFK and other things,
Mm.
it is, at least for now, at least, thought of, I think, in the mainstream society as much more still a fringy issue, right? A little bit
Yes.
kooky, a
Yeah.
little bit weird, maybe. Whereas it should be much more front and center, or at least be scrutinized in a much more
Yes.
sort of serious way, right? So
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem, obviously, is that there are huge amounts of money riding on these chemicals, right? I mean, uh, DuPont and 3M and these companies that made PFAS were making billions and billions of dollars a year
mm,
from these chemicals, right? They're used everywhere. Um, uh, like we're actually seeing something of this. Uh, right now in the US with glyphosate, which is a very, very, which is the number one herbicide that's being used
Mm,
in the US in Roundup, owned by Bayer, who bought Monsanto, I think, in 2018, who were the original creators of glyphosate. Um, it's horribly toxic. It's horribly toxic, and there are all of these class action lawsuits going on at the moment about glyphosate, about its effects, its association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a very particular nasty type of cancer. Uh, Bayer has already paid out billions of dollars in settlements, but they're trying to get immunity. And it looks like actually President Trump has signed an executive order providing immunity for Bayer from harms associated with glyphosate because it is so central to agricultural production in the US.
mm,
Agricultural production in the US, as it takes place now, would collapse without glyphosate. And so Trump has actually said this is like a national security issue. Um, uh, and RFK was talking about this too, saying like the agricultural sector would collapse if you stopped use of glyphosate. So it's a serious business. There are huge vested interests, government and business,
mm,
militating um, uh, as strongly as possible against um, regulation of these chemicals.
mm,
So that's a big problem. But also, I think, I mean, I said make America healthy again is nonpartisan. It isn't. I mean, it should be. And you can see left wing and right wing and centrist people all getting behind it. And that's how it should be. But
mm,
it has become a right wing issue. It has become associated with being right wing
mm,
and with particular people like RFK Jr., who's a lifelong Democrat, right? I
mm,
mean, from one of the great Democrat dynasties in the Kennedy family, right?
mm,
Um, uh, but it has become associated with being right wing. Previously, it was actually more or less a left wing thing, and it was hippies and crunchy mums and people
mm,
in California talking about eating organic food and grass fed beef and raw milk. But it's kind of flipped and overtly at the national
mm.
level become this kind of right wing thing. And so I think that also militates against, to a certain degree, against kind of wider awareness. But maybe,
What,
but maybe there's also a psychological. I'll just say this
mm,
quickly. Maybe there's also a psychological mechanism at work. Like it's like with climate change. Not that I'm saying that I'm like a
mm,
believer in climate change.
mm,
Certain narratives, I think, are so hard to comprehend. They're so these all-encompassing narratives where it's like the environment is completely toxic. Like there are these estrogenic chemicals in the air and the water and the food, and they land in snow on the top of mountains, and they're at the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches. And you go to Antarctica and you dig up an ice core, and there's PFAS in it. Um, uh, it's like it's actually very, very hard, I think, to comprehend that. And I think there's something about for most people where their brains almost shut down. They're like, okay, look, I can't do anything about this. Like I'm actually not even going to care about it. I'm not even going to think about it. Like it doesn't catch mimetically in the right way necessarily as some other issues might. It's so hard to fathom the full kind of scale of the problem and the implications. It's
mm.
almost like it's almost takes on the nature of a kind of like a metaphysical or theological problem, and I think that actually makes it much harder for it to catch and for people to take it seriously. Unfortunately, because they should.
Yeah. I mean, I think I said Ross Dathard before when I meant Ross Dreyer with the crunchy cons, but in any event, well, what can be done, realistically? I mean,
Yeah.
it
So I mean, so the book has a lot of. I mean, I give a lot of individual advice, like on
mm,
Twitter and on my Substack and in the essays and opinion pieces that I write. Like, there are things you can do as an individual to mitigate your exposure to harmful chemicals and improve your health. Like, there are. You can't totally get away from microplastics and all these other endocrine disrupting chemicals, but you can significantly mitigate your exposure, and you should. So
mm,
you can do things like reducing your reliance on plastics, like don't drink from plastic water bottles. Don't, for God's sake, microwave food in plastic. Um, uh, Other things like that to do with plastic. So reduce your reliance on plastic. Exercise, uh, particularly lifting weights if you want to boost your testosterone. Clean up your diet. Eliminate processed food. That's a big one. Learn how to cook as well, because then you can you are in control of the ingredients that go into your body. And if you buy locally sourced food as much as possible, if you cook with whole foods, then you know you can significantly improve your health. Improve your sleep schedule. That's another one. Sleep is a serious determinant of hormonal health. There are studies that show, for example, in older men, if you double your sleep from 4 hours to 8 hours a night, you can double your testosterone, because the majority of testosterone is produced while you're asleep. And actually, older people tend to sleep worse than younger people for a variety of reasons. But this is
mm,
true of young and old, actually. And most people probably don't sleep as well as they could. So there are definitely, I mean, there are all sorts of quite simple things, actually, simple but profound things that you can do to improve your own life and the life of your husband or wife, or girlfriend, boyfriend, and your children and immediate family. But then there are things that need to happen on a political level, and that's why Make America Healthy Again is so important, I think,
mm,
because it's the first recognition, the first real attempt to make health a political issue, a national political issue. And
mm,
yeah, you need new chemical regulations. You need to get certain additives out of food. You need to encourage or make it impossible for like school children to eat ultra processed food while they're at school.
mm,
You need to educate people. You need to improve access in urban environments to good quality food. You know, these things called food deserts that they talk about,
mm,
where you live in an inner city environment, you don't have access to any good quality, freshly produced food. It's just ultra processed food in supermarkets.
mm,
So there are things that there needs to be simultaneously like an individual and a collective effort to
mm,
address these problems. Like individuals can't do anything about plastics, about plastic production, right? Individuals can't do anything about regulation of PFAS chemicals. Um, Individuals can't clean up the oceans. You can go down to the beach and pick up some plastic debris off the beach, but like you
mm,
can't do anything about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is this
mm,
enormous continent-sized raft of plastic. Um, so so yes, I mean that's something that I talk about in the book, is the need not only for individual effort but also some kind of national political effort. But the book does the book does end with some disquieting suggestions about the nature of liberalism. I return to this question. So I start with the Fukuyama and the question of whether liberalism, liberal democracy is a low testosterone system, and then I return at the end and I say, okay, look, we could sort out all of these biological problems, these environmental problems. We could get rid of plastic. We could get rid of the harmful chemicals. We could all start exercising and da da da. But there's still this fundamental question about whether actually liberalism is a satisfying political system for men, or for certain kinds of men who are
mm,
always going to exist. So, um, yeah, I don't. There aren't any easy answers about the nature of liberalism, I don't think.
mm,
And actually, it's worth remembering. Fukuyama addresses this too in The End of History. He says, well, what's going to happen? Well, what we're going to see actually is we're going to see revolts against the system. He talks about immense wars of the spirit. He says, actually some men, because of the kind of stultifying, pacifying nature of liberalism, are going to be driven actually to physical revolt, to war, to
mm,
bloodshed. Um, and one of the examples that I use actually in the book, and it's obviously not something I'm advocating for, is ISIS and the ISIS caliphate in the Middle East. that is, if ISIS is anything, it is a revolt against the spread of liberal democratic values in the Middle East.
Mm,
Uh, and it's a kind of bloody explosion of thymos, religiously tinged, of course, um, uh, in a world that is supposed to be getting more civilized, tending towards democracy, equality, all these kinds of things.
mm,
It's a very bloody reassertion of a completely different view of what society is,
mm,
and the role of men in society. And um not to advocate for it, but I do think that, I don't think that Fukuyama was wrong in suggesting that actually for some men it would be so unbearable that they would be driven to, to excesses of violence and bloodshed in order to provide some kind of interest and meaning beyond just being a consumer.
yeah. I mean, we're dealing with ISIS brides, girls who have went over there and got married and tried to
Yeah,
come back to Australia this time. So it's an interesting topical thing. For one final quick question:
sure.
how many eggs do you actually slunk per day?
At the moment, I'm on slightly reduced rations, but I mean, when I was really going ham, then I ended up doing like 24 a day, which was kind of crazy in hindsight. But that's when I was like doing powerlifting and really, really trying to put on a lot of mass,
Mm,
and it worked. And the thing about slonking raw eggs is that it's very, very easy. If you've seen Cool Hand Luke, which I'm sure many, many people watching this will have, then you'll know that, like, eating 50 boiled eggs or 50 cooked eggs is very difficult. Like, it will practically kill you. It's so difficult to
mm,
do. But you can knock back 50 raw eggs in a very, very easily. In a minute, you can knock back 50 raw eggs
mm,
in a couple of pint glasses or jugs.
mm,
So it's an old bodybuilding trick is what it is.
mm.
It's from the kind of pre-steroid era of bodybuilding. Like, you consume large quantities of raw eggs uh in order to get a massive infusion of protein and cholesterol,
Mm,
because cholesterol
mm.
is a precursor of testosterone.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I won't keep you any longer because I try and keep these things to an hour. I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat to it. Let's hope, I don't know, reform and restore and these new right parties in the UK and maybe One
Mm.
Nation here can incorporate at least some of this
Yeah.
Chi con, or whatever you want to call it, thinking, um, and and appreciate the problem. At least take some efforts to sort of
Yes.
recognize at the very least that it's a politically potent issue. I remember seeing some stats
Mm.
saying that it actually did, in key areas, swing seats to swing the election in favor of President Trump. So it was actually
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
not to be
I
ignored in purely in political terms. But again, thanks very much. I'll drop your the link to your new book, which is excellent, and your and all the rest of it, and your Twitter account, so that people who are unacquainted with Raw Egg Nationalists can check you out. And look forward to keeping in touch. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
No sweat. Thanks very much. Eh? Bye.